Patrick, hello, how are you? Thanks for joining us today.
Doing well. Thank you for the invitation.
Excellent. No, thank you. I really appreciate your time. So, Patrick, tell us a bit about yourself. So, basically, you are a researcher on Islam, Muslim converts into the USA. Tell us a little bit more about what you do and how you got into this.
I am an independent scholar. I research history of conversion to Islam in the United States. Is I would say the main topic that we're talking about today, and my main topic of research. And I also look at the history of religion in the United States, questions about conversion more broadly, and other specific groups within that. But um, how I got into it is I have been someone who's been interested in religious studies for a long time. Even as a child, I was interested in the study of religion, but I did my undergrad and I did not study Islam. And then when I went to grad school, which was around 2007, but I had made the decision to do that around 2005, so it was still in the wake of September 11th culturally in the United States. And because I had not been able to find a good job with my undergrad degree, that where I did not focus on Islam, I thought it would be wise to focus on Islam with my grad school degree. And then when I got there, I was given the advice to do something that really motivates you, that's really interesting to you personally. And I was always interested in religion in the United States, especially with regards to racial issues and conversion. And I had heard that, doing some review of the literature, there was very little done on white and Latino Muslims. And so I had started doing some preliminary research into that. And since all the literature was about African American Muslims, that's what I started reading. And there were hints you might mention here or there in the different literature about whites and Latinos. So I looked into that. But the only new clues I could find were looking through African American Islamic history. So I ended up broadening my horizons and looking at African American Islam in addition to white and Latino Muslims. And so now I still do conversion, basically from the beginning to today. So I haven't released my newest work on that. It's still forthcoming. It's under review right now, but yep. I look at from basically the year 1800 to 2025.
So interesting. Where did you do your undergraduate and your master's and PhD from?
I did my undergraduate at University of Colorado Boulder, and Frederick Denny is the Islamic Studies person who was there at the time, but I believe he was on sabbatical and then retired, so I just never ended up taking any Islam courses there. Did my graduate work at University of Denver, and for the PhD specifically, it was a joint program between University of Denver and the Iliff School of Theology. And technically my degree is in religion and social change, and I consider that religious studies.
That's so interesting. Have you heard of Professor John Esposito in Georgetown University?
Sure.
I had the pleasure to interview him, and he was telling me how when he started studying Islam initially, all his friends told him, "You're never going to get a job." And he was saying that he actually didn't have any work relating to his studies until the Iranian Revolution. So he was saying he owes his first lectures to Ayatollah Khamenei. So you must be a brave man as well, because I can't imagine that is such an interesting field, but from a point of view of like an earnings and a career, it must be tough going, no?
Yes, I actually watched your interview with him,
Ah,
and I felt a tinge of resentment when he mentioned that that he got his first Lexus off of Khomeini,
me too,
because
me too.
it, uh, it's never really paid off for me in terms of a successful academic career. And I didn't take some of the risks that some other people take, where you travel from one year position to a 1 year position all across the country. I wasn't willing to do that for various reasons. And so, I played a part. I played a part in not having that successful academic career, but I I cannot stop. I've tried to suppress my interest in religious studies and try to move on to other things, but it is something that has been inside of me from my childhood, and I am miserable if I try to suppress it. So I continue to research and write. I have other religious studies interests, but I found it unhealthy um, to not address the I believe natural interests and natural desires. And like you said, this topic is an extremely fascinating topic, and I have benefited greatly personally, and I feel like I've shared it with the world to a limited extent, to help other people benefit from it as well.
I think that's all right. And also, so I remember when I was doing my graduate degree, I did a bit of religious studies, but I was always frustrated how when academics, or at least until like maybe the 60s and 70s, whenever they talked about religion, they talked about Christianity, but then labeled it a religion. But religion is not just one religion. A religion is like lots of religions, and then it's not all the same. Sometimes it's hard to paint everything in one brush, and I think that kind of the frustration that I used to have. Um, so I think it's really useful to have someone like yourself who is looking into like Islam in solely.
Well, I just to comment on that, I would say that yeah, I'm a millennial slash Gen Xer. That's my age range, and so we came up at a different era where there was more acceptance, at least in the United States, of religious diversity. And I come from a more liberal family, and so I was exposed to diversity. And then the American Academy of Religion had changed by the time I went to the university, and it was more accepting of these non-Christian religious studies, but Islam was still being somewhat neglected. And as a matter of fact, for a brief period when I was doing my graduate studies, we didn't even have a permanent Islamic studies scholar. I had the privilege during my master's work of working under Dr. Liaquat Takim, but he took a job at McMaster, I believe, and had to leave. And we had Andrea Stanton come in shortly after, but she wasn't a permanent hire. And so there's a lot of different pressures on her and expectations of her, and as a graduate student, so I had to work with a lot of different people. But um, to your point, that not, throughout a lot of academia, there is not a lot of interest in Islam, if you look at it from the broad perspective. So it was at least a privilege to be able to work on it at all.
Yeah, amazing. Before I had the opportunity to speak with John Esposito, but also then I looked into a lot of the work that you're doing as well. I was under the impression that Islam must have got introduced to USA through Europe because Europe was already had a long kind of history of encounters with Islam, and I was actually surprised that the first introduction really of Islam to the USA was through the the slaves that were coming from Africa. Is that right?
Well, there are some debates about if, first of all, what we call the United States was not the United States when importation of enslaved Muslims occurred. And so, if we're talking about this broader history, there is some debate whether there were transatlantic uh, Muslims who had come prior to the era of the modern slave era. But for recorded history that there's widespread agreement on, yes, I would say it's mainly came through enslaved Muslims, although uh, Americans some Americans had encounters with Muslims abroad, and so they brought those experiences, and then some had even begun to study about Islam abroad or read literature about it. So, and most of that literature was produced in Europe.
So when it comes to the slave trade and kind of Islam, because I've heard somewhere that maybe about 15 or 20% of the slaves coming in, being brought in to the Americas were Muslims. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, and I think the estimations are really vague, and maybe we shouldn't get caught up in an exact percentage.
Mm.
And I think most of that 20% number was estimated for in South America, and where there does seem to have been a larger concentration of evidence of enslaved Muslims. But in North America, especially the land that became the United States, I would say it's more likely that the percentage was significantly smaller, perhaps under 10%. So we don't really know the exact numbers, but that's roughly right.
I remember reading this really interesting book. I can't remember who wrote it. I think it was called Slaves of Allah, and it was about like early preachers going into Africa to convert Christianity and encounters that they had with Muslims who were quite aware of Christian history because obviously we have a lot of similar characters and similar people within Islam and Christianity. So they had a bit of a rough time trying to convince those people to convert to Christianity. Have you read that book?
No, I'm not familiar with that
I'm
one.
going to find the link and maybe send that over to you. Hey there. I hope you're enjoying this episode. Let me just take a moment to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is kindly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a complete A to Z Amazon account management service. So if you're looking to start an e-commerce business or you already have a business that you want to take to the next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. Just for transparency purposes, let me also mention that WLC is a company that I personally created and am a director of. So when you get in touch with WLC, you will be speaking with directly myself or my team, and we very much look forward to speaking with you to see how we can serve your needs. Thank you. And with that said, let's get back to the episode. Let me know what you think.
Okay, thank you.
So, so when it comes to like the slave trade, whereabouts were the slaves coming in from? Was it all over, or is there concentration on certain geographical areas?
Yeah, well, the slave trade was basically the western coast, sub-Saharan western coast, down through where the Congo is. So basically Senegal down to the Congo, and the I believe the largest concentrations of Muslims came from the Senegambia area and from the region where Nigeria is, those two regions. But I believe most of the more prominent enslaved Muslims we have records about were Senegambian or from that more western part of Africa.
And is it true that like many of those people coming in must have had some kind of an education, like whether it was to read the Quran or so? Is there any like written documentation of their experiences at the time, religious experiences?
There there's written documentation. There's some Arabic writing, especially in the Omar Said is an enslaved Muslim in North Carolina, and he wrote in Arabic religious writing. But as far as recollections about their life in Africa, their Islamic life in Africa, I'm not sure if that was your question. I don't believe that exists, but and I believe there's other traces of Islam-related writings. I have heard of amulets and other writings, but nothing about their time in Africa.
And is there like records of like how freely were they able to practice their religion, or was it something that they had to keep secret? And is that why they kind of lost some of those traditions? What was the experience like for people at the time?
Well, we don't have a lot of evidence about it, and so the evidence that we do have, and to put it into context, there was not an incentive for slaveholders to record this, the practices of the enslaved. And some interested observers would occasionally go to places and they might confuse the practices of one person with another. But if someone was distinct and did something that was, they had a lot of confidence in how to maintain their Islamic practices, then that did occur occasionally. There is an enslaved Muslim who was in Virginia, I believe, who was known to go off at the prescribed prayer times and pray. I really doubt 5 times a day, but probably the dawn and sunset prayers,
Yes.
if that were possible. But then we know the largest evidence of Islamic practices down in the Georgia Sea Islands, and where the there is a prayer room, a prayer house that the enslaved there used, but I don't think we have confirmed that the Muslims used it. But there is records of them using prayer rugs and prayer caps and making sure that they pray and follow avoidance of alcohol.
Wow. And so is this like in late 80s, 1800s, sorry, like 1890, or what's the time period?
No, this is most of the evidence that we have comes from the late 18th century through the mid 19th century.
Okay.
Slavery was ended with the 13th Amendment, and I believe that's 1863.
And there's no evidence really, is there, of like Muslims entering the Americas with Columbus and that journey from Spain, and because there was a lot of Muslims in Spain at the time, although there was like the Spanish Inquisition going on, so maybe they were keeping things a bit secret.
Yeah, I believe there's evidence of Muslims being on the ships with Columbus, and we know of there is another one with another Muslim that came with Coronado's expedition. Estevanico is his name, and then they travel from Florida all the way out to New Mexico. And he's probably the most well-known. But there were undoubtedly people who had hid their Muslim faith under forced conversion and came to the Americas. I believe there's evidence of that in Mexico and South America. I don't think we found evidence of any of those communities in the land that became the United States, but we do know that there were people who did the same thing who were Jewish, and they were known as crypto Jews. They did come up into the United States and settle with the early settlers in New Mexico, which was settled in 1598 in Santa Fe, and there were the crypto Jew community there. So I suspect that this did occur with the Spanish, and that we may eventually find some traces of Muslim people who pass along their faith in secret.
Because a lot of people in early America, they were all coming in from all over Europe. I'm actually really surprised that there wasn't more Muslims within those kind of individuals, whether it was coming from what's now Turkey or Spain or even Sicily and all of those places. Or do you think that maybe there may have been some, but then they kind of over time they kind of lost that kind of heritage?
Yeah, I think that the conversos from Spain are the most likely source of these people, but we don't really have, as far as I'm aware, better evidence from other countries in southern Italy or in any other place in Western Europe.
Hmm. And with the slaves arriving into the Americas, like, is there a record of like maybe within the next generation or two, um, how did they kind of lose that sense of religion? Did they have like a down, um, kind of a low period where Islam was kind of almost in practice non-existent, and then it kind of started spreading again? Or how did the trajectory go?
Well, as far as the evidence shows, we know of no proof that Islamic identity was passed along to the 20th century. There are some individuals who claim that for themselves, but that's different than proof.
Yeah.
And some sort of third-party observer of Muslim practice being continued is something very different. Now, what usually happened in the slave communities is that slaves from different regions, so of different ethnicities and different religious practices, were brought together. Occasionally, there would be a preference for one particular ethnicity if that ethnicity was stereotyped as being particularly good in cultivating a certain crop. But frequently, in order to prevent slave revolts, there was an incentive for slaveholders to put together people who did not speak the same language. And by doing that, the slaves had to begin to form a new shared culture that was not distinct to their old traditional one, but sometimes incorporated the traditional culture. And keep in mind, too, many Muslims from West Africa at the time, their ideas about Islam were not 21st century fundamentalist Islam. Almost never. They were blended with other local practices, and so they were more used to identifying their Islamic life with religious cultures that they were encountering in the slave fields. And therefore, when exchanges happened over the generations, almost always the identity of being Muslim was lost, and the identity of being other ethnicities was lost, and they developed a unique culture. So that's generally what occurred.
And so over time, um, maybe in the next generation of slaves that are coming in, once slavery was kind of over, and that next generation, were they able to reestablish links from the lands that their ancestors came from, or was that completely broken for generations to come?
Well, I believe foreign importation of slaves was outlawed in the United States in 1808. So there did continue to be some illegal importation, but the numbers were significantly lower. By that point, there were, I believe, maybe 2 million slaves and a sufficient amount to be exploited for the South's economic incentives and the United States economic incentives. Um, and so there was not a lot of fresh um, Muslim identity coming in at that point, and so the rediscovery of an Islamic past was very rare, and I don't really know of a case during the 19th century, during the slave era, where there was something where um, someone claimed that, oh, my grandfather was a slave, my grandparents were slaves, I'm going to, or I'm sorry, Muslims, I'm going to start being practicing Islam.
Yeah. And what about like other customs and culture? Like, for example, is there links? Was there distinct Islamic music or poetry in the lands where the slaves were brought in from? And is that still can that still be traced within the music and the uh, kind of poetry and all of that grew up within America, like blues and jazz and other things? So when did that link all break and that kind of restarted at some stage later, or was that a continuous kind of a link?
Well, there is some evidence of material and musical culture continuing, and perhaps just oral culture generally continuing from Islamic influence practices. And I think the strongest evidence is the um, development of the blues musical genre, especially as seen in the recordings of Alan Lomax. Um, and I think he found the strongest evidence in the Natchez River, um, or I'm sorry, the Natchez community along the Mississippi River in Mississippi. And uh, so there are certain tones and styles of vocalization that seem to be resonant with Islamic Quranic recitation or prayer recitation. There's other evidence of potential transmission of practices. I've seen some research on um, quilting, perhaps coming from Islamic practices from Africa. Um, and we know that some of the amulets and other magical devices were sometimes influenced by Islamic culture.
And then um, so going into like maybe the 1900s, what was the situation like? And then when did like that next wave of Muslim immigration started coming into the USA and where from?
Well, Muslim immigration to the United States non-enslaved Muslim immigration kind of begins in a notable wave in the last few decades of the 19th century with immigration mainly from Arab lands, some from Turkey. Um, we do see some from North Africa as well. And I would just state the majority of immigrants from Arab lands were Christian. Um, but we do start seeing that in the late 19th century. Into the 20th century, that continues. We get a lot more South Asian immigration on both sides of the continent, actually. And So those communities start to develop by the first decades of the 20th century, and we start to see Muslim organizations show up in California, in New York, um, and by 1920, there's a handful in both places, and then also in some of the more Midwestern cities, especially Detroit area.
That including from like South Asia, South Asia as well. Immigration started coming in from around 1920.
Oh, prior to that,
Really, it's quite early.
especially in
I would have
California.
thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised about that because I would have thought because of the difficulty in travel and because of their closer links to Europe, if anything, they probably would have been. So yeah, I'm surprised. So who do you know where people were coming in from in like South Asia, and where were they? Um, I know you actually. I heard you talk about like the Ahmadi community. Was that the first kind of South Asians, or?
No, but Punjabis are known for having come into California, which is on the west coast of the United States, and therefore they will cross the Pacific Ocean and settling in Southern California, um, and forming some early Muslim organizations down there. And there were, like I said, most of those people were Punjabi. Um, and we do have evidence of um, Punjabis, but possibly from other parts of South Asia, of Muslims in the states north of California. There's even some theories that the founder of the Nation of Islam, W.D. Farad, came through that gateway and initially settled in the northern West Coast states and traveled up and down those states. And we do have evidence of South Asian Muslims from Northern California all through Southern California, and this newer evidence about South Asians shows them in Oregon, Washington, and Montana. So there, we may learn more and more about early settlements, and as far as the Ahmadis are concerned, I have a early article from California that mentions of the two communities that I will refer to here as the Qadiani and the Lahori communities, of a Lahori community, Lahori members in Southern California. And the Lahore community would go on to develop one of the California's strongest centers for Ahmadiyya Islam. However, the majority of Ahmadiyya come from the Qadiani community, and they started coming. The proselytizers came in the 1920s and settled mainly on the East Coast and moved west to the Midwest. And they came as proselytizers, not as regular immigrants. Immigrants would come increasingly from the 20s to 30s and settle with the converts that were made.
See, and when was the first formal mosque created in the USA? And also, does that exist still, or is it so not in someone's house praying in the house, but like a formal structure?
Okay, a structure designed specifically to host prayer. Well, if we say that the evidence of the prayer building on the in the slave era is not a mosque, because we can't say that for sure, then I believe the earliest evidence is in Detroit in the 1920s that there was construction done, and led with the participation of a wide variety of Shia, Sunni, and Ahmadi Muslims in the Detroit area. And then soon after that, there was construction of a mosque in Iowa, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the Midwest. And they have taken the name the Mother Mosque because for a long time it was the longest standing early mosque
Oh
in the
wow.
United States. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I've heard the name the Mother Mosque. Is that still around, or does it still exist?
Yes, it still exists. I believe it's not used for regular prayer, but I believe it is used for um, occasional like tours and occasional ceremonies.
And who was that built by? Was it Shia, Sunnis, Ahmadis? Who created that?
Mostly Arab Sunnis.
Hmm, interesting. And also, so the founder of the Nation of Islam, where was he from?
No one knows for sure. It's still a very debated question. Uh, to me, the evidence suggests that his roots were in the Punjab.
Oh,
Um,
really?
but yeah, but we don't know for sure. And there's a new book that came out this year about it. People still debate about it. It's actually a matter of some controversy. So,
Wow.
um,
And was he like
but
a religious man? Was he a practicing Muslim? Or was he more of like a political person, a bit more like Elijah Muhammad?
um, we don't know as much about his personal identity, but let me just say to clarify a few things. Nation of Islam teaches that he came from Mecca. Um, and when I say that it's likely he came from the Punjab, that is based on subsequent scholarly analysis. But I wanted to clarify what they do teach, and since we don't know for sure,
Yeah.
that is the teaching. Um, and then I do want to say, um, as far as his religious behavior, he seems to have been very well read and a pious man as far as the reports are of him. Um, as a practicing Muslim, um, he does not have, there's not a lot of reports about him that indicate that he was following a stricter Sunni or any kind of orthodox form of Islam, but he taught using the Lahori produced Quran, translated by Maulana Muhammad Ali, um,
Oh, wow.
and yeah, and to this day, in fact, the Nation of Islam still uses that same Quran,
Wow.
which has the English next to the Arabic, and they get them from the Lahori community. Um, and he did teach from that, and he taught a lot of Islamic basics. But the teaching, the presentation of his ideas within the Nation of Islam's teachings are that he presented Islam in a way that could communicate best with the African Americans he encountered in Detroit who knew nothing of Islam.
At that time, or maybe even now, is there like a big percentage of Asians in Nation of Islam? I didn't even know about that. I thought it was solely like a African American organization.
No, there are some I've heard of. Some people join. I'm sure their percentage is extremely small.
Mm.
I've heard of some white people in Nation of Islam and Latino people, definitely. And so people from, I believe I've heard of Turkey and South Asia in the Nation of Islam.
Oh, wow. How long was Elijah Muhammad the leader? Was he like, when did he start? 1930 something or?
Yeah, so the Farad Muhammad, W.D. Farad, arrived in Detroit
Mhm.
and began organizing the Nation of Islam in the year 1930. Soon after, I believe it's 1931, Elijah Muhammad joins the community. Farad disappears in the year 1934, and Elijah Muhammad takes leadership of one of the factions of Nation of Islam, and that becomes the
Ah,
faction that we know today as the Nation of Islam. And he leads that faction until his death in 1975.
okay. And um, was it, obviously, it was very political. It was like a political movement. Um, was it an Islamic or a Muslim movement other than in name? Is there like I mean, there's probably different opinions on that, isn't it? Like Muslims would look at certain things in a different way, and you're looking at academically. Actually, so when you look at all of these different groups, how do you define what's a Muslim and what's not a Muslim, and who is included in your studies and who's not? Because, like for example, Ahmadis, generally speaking, the mainstream Muslims don't consider them part of Islam. So how do you
Right.
how do you draw those lines?
As a scholar
Mm,
and a non-Muslim,
mm,
um, I try to cast my net as wide as possible.
yeah.
And I believe the only people I exclude or have excluded, and I haven't completely excluded them, are the people who were in the group called Sufism Reoriented. The only people who I've actually intentionally not talked about in detail, because their Sufism is not, and that's Islamic mysticism for those who may not know what we might call that, is so far removed from Islam that it has almost nothing to do with it at all. But I do not really draw a line. And part of the reason I don't draw a line is because the interactions and transmission of knowledge is so complex
Mm,
that in every single instance, you can find abundant evidence that shows Muslims, for instance, in the Nation of Islam, who are studying the Quran, who are studying Hadith,
wow.
who are taking prayers, and how they are identified by the scholar is can have implications, legal implications that might be potentially harmful.
Mm.
So the scholars, I think, especially in the United States, need to take extra caution to not cause any harm by any labels that they employ.
Sorry, what was this Sufi group that you? What was the name of this group?
Sufism Reoriented. It is, I believe it still exists, a group that follows the teachings of Meher Baba, a South Asian teacher who famously did not speak, took a vow of silence.
Wow.
But they came, their genealogy goes back to Hazrat Inayat Khan,
Oh, okay.
um, because after he died, his American followers split up into different communities, and one of the communities ended up going with Meher Baba.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. So in mainstream, that's interesting actually because I do kind of um, prescribe to the whole kind of Sufi, Chishti, Sufis kind of tradition. How
Mhm.
was and when was Sufism introduced to the USA?
Well, let's assume that we're not talking about enslaved
Hmm.
Sufi
Yeah.
practices, because I assume, because of the widespread practices of Sufism in West Africa,
Hmm.
that, I mean, practices had come to the United States through those routes.
True.
But what we might distinguish as Sufism has a real interesting history, you know, and it may not be what you know. I'm not sure how much you've looked into this, but the early, well-known first convert to Islam in the United States, Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb, who converted to Islam, and he's white American who converted to Islam around 1886 or 1888. He got interested in Islam through reading Ahmadiyya advertisement in the literature of the Theosophical Society, which is a group that is formed to research all religions from a more liberal perspective, but also occult and esoteric perspective. And he was involved in the early um, center of activity of theosophical activity. And it so happened that the community he was involved with was also involved with other occult research where they had become interested in Sufism. And so in 1885, members of this broader theosophical community, led by the leader of the community to which Alexander Russell Webb was connected, created what they called a Sufic circle. And they created it based on mainly the texts that they had, academic texts that they had come across, but they were in communication with Muslims from South Asia. And so that was invented. Now, it seems that that kind of faded away pretty quickly. But what's real interesting about that Sufic circle, and then it was later known as the Order of Sufis, is that one of the individuals, C.H.A. Beauregard, who was a librarian at New York Public Library, one of the individuals who was a member, would join up when Hazrat Inayat Khan came in 1910 to the United States to begin promoting Sufism. He would join up with him and participate in it. And there are other links between this early community of esotericists who were interested in Sufism and Islam and the Sufi community led by Hazrat Inayat Khan. The evidence about that is not particularly strong, but there's certainly traces of that. So Hazrat Inayat Khan is widely known today as the non-secret leader of the first Sufi community, but he starts founding that in around 1910 in the United States, and that community grows in the 1920s.
Wow. I still haven't. I've read or I've seen a lot of books by Inayat Khan. I've never been able to figure out his background. Like, is he from a kind of a mainstream Islamic kind of a background, or is what's his background? Do you know?
It was very mixed, but he was primarily oriented with the Chishti tradition.
And was he a Sunni Muslim?
As far as I know, he was, but he changed his religious practices when he got Western followers. And so he stopped identifying with Islam, and initially the evidence suggests that he was teaching them Islam, Sunni Islam, in addition to his Sufi teachings. But his Sufi teachings were more universalistic because he was influenced by Hindu
he had like
well.
I think he's kind of school of thought was that it transcends religion and is greater than, like, it's not just confined to Islamic kind of principles.
Right.
I think also his daughter, I think her name was Maryam, who was like a war hero in World War. I think there's a statue of her now in the UK.
Yeah, I can't recall her name, but I do know that she was a spy for the Allied forces. And
Maryam. Interesting. So at the moment, currently in the USA, what's the percentage of Muslims in the overall community population?
The percentage of Americans who are Muslim, I believe it's no more than 1 or 2%.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at, and I was really surprised. I was shocked. Is that because the Muslims that are there are confined to certain geographical areas, so they might be more densely populated in certain counties or cities, and then obviously because America's so vast, are there any cities where Muslims reach to, like, I don't know, 10% or something like that?
I don't think 10%, but maybe in Philadelphia they have a higher percentage. Philadelphia is known by some people as Muslim town. and that's on the eastern side of the United States. And there are many neighborhoods down there. And then in addition to that, there's Dearborn, Michigan, which has a probably, and I don't know the actual percentage, but people claiming Islamic heritage is probably over 50% in Dearborn, but I don't know the numbers.
Wow. And how is it measured, the size of the Muslim community? Is this part of the census in the USA now, like religious background?
No, it's we do not in the United States ask questions about religious affiliation in the census. So we do. There's nonprofit organizations that do research on that. Some are led by Muslims, um, but most are not. The most prominent is the Pew Research Center. But in addition, there's some Muslim organizations that do demographic research.
Interesting. So is there, like, between the different um, kind of polling organizations, is there any like big dispute in the numbers, or do they more or less agree um, in terms of how many Muslims there are in the USA?
Oh, there have been very big disputes. I have seen numbers of 10 million, some numbers, 1 million, less than 1 million
Wow.
at the same years. And so, I don't have a good recommendation for that other than to state that the ISPU's mosque study is really useful because they actually get in touch with the mosques. It's not a phone survey or just a phone survey. It's communication with organizations. Now, it doesn't include all Muslims.
Hmm.
It's Sunni oriented, but they will go to great lengths above and beyond what the Pew Research Center does.
And what about Ismaili Shias? Is there like a big kind of led by Aga Khan? Is there a big Ismaili community in the USA?
No, I've heard of Ismailis, but I don't know much detail
Okay.
about them.
Okay. And so Nation of Islam. So after Elijah Muhammad, actually by the end of the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, what was the size of Nation of Islam by that time?
Well, that's another hotly debated question, and I've worked on that a lot for my forthcoming book. What was the size of the Nation of Islam of people who were active participants? And I don't know if you're familiar with demographic studies of religious followers. Frequently, we distinguish between active participants and people who claim identity.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting. Yeah. How do
and
you do
how
that?
well the definitions are up to the researcher.
Mm.
So, what would active participant mean in a mosque?
Mm.
Do you have to show up to 2 Friday prayers
Yeah.
every month?
Yeah.
Do you have to show up if your work does not permit you to do that? Do you have to show up to other activities? Do you have to donate regularly? These are really difficult to define. So
Yeah.
the size of the Nation of Islam, and the successor to Elijah Muhammad, his son Imam Mu'tasim Muhammad,
Mm.
he sometimes gave the number of there were 30,000 Muslims
Okay.
in the Nation of Islam, but sometimes he said there were 100,000. Sometimes he said there were 1,000,000. So we don't really know, and they said they stopped keeping records after he became the head. So we don't really know. And then, as you know, it's difficult. I'm sure it's difficult to say with Muslims that especially in a major city, if you mosque hop and go to a lot of different mosques,
Mm.
how are they going to count you?
Yeah.
So the difficulties in data collection are huge.
Yeah. I think that's interesting also, because in Muslim academic circles, I've also heard about how because when people talk about secularism in Muslim countries, I think that's another kind of problematic area because it's very hard to define what a secular Muslim is. Um, because it's like you said, it's so hard to define what a Muslim is. Like, is it saying the prayers? Is it fasting? Is it not drinking alcohol? Is it so it is very hard. But I think yeah, secularism and Islam is quite difficult to kind of draw a line there somewhere as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and if we have these issues with how do you define um, any religious person in the United States, and because in the United States, a lot of people will say that they're Catholic,
Yeah.
and then there's a term cultural Catholic that's widely used. And cultural Christian, I believe, is sometimes used in Europe, but the same thing happens with Islam, and where people were raised, especially people who are the children of immigrants, and the children are raised entirely in the United States. Their identity as a Muslim and practicing as a Muslim may be extremely different between the ages of 9 years old and 29 years old. So that is something that we would have to take into consideration.
Yeah. And so within like the Nation of Islam, after Elijah Muhammad, in brief, what happened between Waris Din Muhammad and Louis Farrakhan Khan? I actually don't know about Louis Farrakhan Khan much. So is he a practicing? Is he a Muslim, or was that split a religious split, or was it a political split? What happened there?
Well, to answer that question, you have to look at it from the perspective of the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam believes that they were taught the true Islam, not the Islam of the Arabs, not the Islam of South Asians, but the true Islam of the true Muslims, and that's what they were taught. And this Islam that might be called Orthodox Islam is not necessarily true Islam, but they're flexible about it. So Warthi Muhammad comes in 1975 and immediately changes the teachings to be more aligned with Orthodox Muslims, Sunni Muslims across the world. And at first, and to be clear, he did not say we are following other teachers necessarily. We have our own practices of Sunni Islam.
Yeah.
But Louis Farrakhan, who went with Warthi Muhammad for a few years, in 1977 says, I can no longer agree with this. Elijah Muhammad taught the teachings of Farad Muhammad, and I believe that is a true Islam, and I can no longer tolerate this other fake, or Orthodox Islam or whatever. He splits off, and within a few years, by 1983, he starts a new Nation of Islam and has Nation of Islam organizations all across the country and is extremely well known. And but I do want to point out, in 1985, he begins to implement the use of the Quran again, and he begins to encourage people to participate in Ramadan with the same time of more Orthodox Muslims. And over the years, he encourages people to study Hadith, and he has made motions towards what might be called Orthodox Islam. So there's a lot of gray area there, and hopefully I painted a little bit of a picture.
Wow. And then, so what happened to Waris Din Muhammad? Did he have like a Malcolm X moment, or did he go do a Hajj, or did he actually, before even 1975, did he get influenced by Malcolm X, or what happened? How did he get to where he was?
Yeah, so his progression to a more Orthodox Islam was slow. He has given conflicting details and accounts of his early life. about what led him down this path. Sometimes he says that he was introduced to more orthodox teachings through his Arabic teachers at the Nation of Islam school, elementary school, in Chicago, especially in the 1950s. And his father always told him to question and analyze the teachings for himself. And then, in addition, he, while a minister for the Nation of Islam in Philadelphia in the early 1960s, he came under the influence of a man named Muhammad Abdullah, who was a proselytizer for the Lahori Ahmadiyya community, and he taught working Muhammad Arabic and Urdu, actually, and began to encourage him to go down these lines. And over the years, through his contacts with with Elijah Muhammad, Wardi Muhammad, he met foreign Muslims. He met Sufis. He went to Pakistan in the 60s, and I believe he took his Hajj in the 60s as well, his first Hajj. And by the time, and then during the time he would go down this route of more Orthodox Islam, then come back to the Nation of Islam, and then leave again. He was early on projected to be the true heir of Elijah Muhammad, but talk of that had faded over the years. So there was not a widespread expectation that he would be in 1975, although many people claim that. But by 1975, upon the death of his father, he was fully on board with more Orthodox Islam. In terms of a Malcolm X moment, no, he did not have what is kind of characterized as a moment of revelation like he did.
Between Wardi Muhammad, Malcolm X, and Muhammad Ali, in the history of recent history of USA, are those three people the biggest kind of influences in Islamic Muslim converts in America, or is there someone kind of more influential than them in religious terms?
Well, it's hard to measure because everyone knows who Muhammad Ali is. Mm-hmm. Most people today have heard of Malcolm X. If they don't, if the younger generation doesn't really know who he is, they probably heard the name before. Almost everyone knows that Muhammad Ali is a boxer.
Yeah.
And Wardi Muhammad is virtually unknown outside the Muslim circles. Louis Farrakhan may be known to some people who were paying attention in the 90s. In the 90s, when you had a new wave of conversion, Louis Farrakhan was extremely well known. He was in the news all the time. But as far as today, there is not widespread knowledge, and I'm talking about on the grand popular level of Muslims, the Muslim leaders in the United States. If someone's curious about Islam and attends a mosque or starts looking online, they may hear of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. He's the person most likely that they'll hear about, but and they'll probably have already heard and maybe read a little bit about Malcolm X. So I would say, because there's so many levels to the process of conversion, Malcolm X is probably the person most influential on those who still seek the path of conversion.
Yeah, I think you're right. With Malcolm X, even now I've heard so many very influential people who have converted to Islam just through reading Malcolm X's book after his lifetime, who didn't know really anything about Malcolm X directly, but his legacy is still kind of very much influential in the USA. But also, I'm surprised. So I'm trying to think of what's the guy's name who was the Turkish spiritual leader in Pennsylvania. I think he's passed away recently. He was
Gulen.
Sorry,
Gulen. Yeah.
Yes. So So there's people like that in America. I mean, Fatullah Gulen, generally a lot of Muslims wouldn't know him, but he's been voted as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world. And then
Hmm.
yesterday I had the pleasure of interviewing, for example, Sheikh Ninawi, who is in Georgia in America. And again, he's one of the people who has been voted as one of the 500 most influential. So very influential Muslims in America. Um, and partially that's why I'm still a little bit surprised how Islam is still a very unknown in the general public. It's still a very kind of unknown kind of an entity. Um, it's still like an alien kind of a religion for most people maybe in America.
Well, to put things a little bit in context, and maybe to make it easier for people from the UK to compare with the United States,
Yeah.
is to see that, first of all, um, the Muslim immigration was significantly reduced down to almost nothing between, I believe, 1927 and 1965. Almost nothing in the United States, with the exclusion of most Asian immigration, Asian and African immigration during that time. And so that would have been a major period for immigration because, especially in the years immediately following World War II, the conversion movements, and keep in mind that there are more, as far as I've been able to count, there are more converts in the Muslim converts in the United States than any other place in the
Mhm.
West. And so the United States is not slacking in that regard, but the Muslim immigrant population um, came by the tens of thousands starting in 1965, and tens of thousands in the country of over 350 million people just simply cannot um, be more than a small element of the country. And conversion is not necessarily a factor of growth of immigration. So when you have growth of immigration, there may be more converts because converts generally come through contact with immigrants in today's world. Um, but that has there's not a one-to-one ratio or anything like that. In addition, if you look at more recent studies, there has been a decrease in conversion, especially over the last 10 years, 15 years, as the older African American Muslim communities have declined in vitality, is what I would say, and the second and third generation of Muslim immigrants are not spreading it in a way that communicates to people in the way that the older African American Muslim communities did. So, taking all those things into consideration, it's more understandable. But
Wow, that's
yeah,
interesting to know. So in the last 10,
yeah,
15 years in conversions in the USA, there's been a decline. I would have thought
yeah.
with the internet and all of these things, social media, and also just generally um, um, America's um, interaction with Muslim countries, whether it's Iraq, Syria, whether even if it's like in not in pleasant terms, but it's kind of a bit in your face. So I would have thought that that would have had an opposite effect. It would have increased awareness and maybe increased conversion.
I would do want to comment briefly on the social media aspect of it. Um, Social media is producing religious results that we can't anticipate because it's so unregulated. And so um, the ability of um, religious movements to recruit off social media is still very poorly understood. And the more successful social media recruitment is, the more organized generally. But that doesn't necessarily produce results through sheer willpower. And to your point about when Muslims are in the news, you would see increase in conversion. That had been true. Muslims were in the news a lot in the United States, as Professor Esposito mentioned, in 1979, and there was growth of conversions after that. In the Gulf War in the early 90s, growth of conversion after that. After the 9/11, there was a spike in conversion after that. But now, because so much of our lives are on this social media, where people's information is coming through algorithms and bubbles, the trends in how people seek religion and claim religion are changing drastically.
Do you see any? Have you had an opportunity to study Islamic Muslim conversion in Europe, especially in the UK? Do you see any patterns, any distinction between what's happening in the USA, how people are converting, but how their lives are after conversion, and in the USA, in the UK, how are, like, for example, how are they being accepted within their own family and their communities after converting?
I've looked at this a little bit, and the context is so different in the UK versus America because of the higher concentration of Muslim majority communities or Muslim neighborhoods. When a person is in the process of seeking a new religion, generally and this is, I guess, pre-social media days, but generally they develop a relationship with people who follow that religion already. And when there is more availability of people from that religion, then they will develop stronger bonds and convert. And in terms of so that is an issue where there's more availability in Europe.
Yeah.
So in the UK for sure. So because of that, you see more people who are joining South Asian communities and following more South Asian trends in religious practices and religious beliefs. And in the United States, where people generally meet Muslims in college, and they might meet one or two, you don't see that same availability to entice conversion. In terms of acceptance, well, there are similar trends. What we see across the world right now, but is converts taking on more traditional practices that weren't really done prior to, I'd say, the 90s, the late 90s and 2000s, which is growing a beard. That wasn't done on a widespread level. Growing the beard for men, wearing hijab for women, or dressing other Islamic ways. That is becoming more widespread now all across the world. In terms of family treatment, in America, I think there are more reports of having difficult conflicts with the family, but we come from a more Christian identity community, so that may account for that.
Yeah, actually, that would be interesting to see as well, because in the USA, people are generally more religious than they are in the UK. So in the UK now, Christianity is not the majority of the population. I think seculars are now, there's more seculars than there are Christians. Whereas in the USA, people tend to be more practicing Christians. So I wonder how is there a difference with conversions because of that religious background? Does it make things easier for converts, or does it make it more difficult for them in being accepted?
I think it can vary depending on certain trends in culture. So, like there's a study of Irish converts,
Yeah.
and they found that in the 90s, what you had was more people who were from punk backgrounds or other kind of secular backgrounds. But starting in the 2000s, you increasingly see people come from Catholic backgrounds. And so it depends on that particular context, but also what's going on with the particular religious community from which someone is coming from. So, and I believe that the majority of converts in the United States in the 21st century are coming from more weak religious backgrounds. And so they're more like European converts to Islam. So.
And what about is there, if you look at Canada and USA, is there like a difference there in terms of either based on percentage, how many converts there are in each country, or how many mosques there are, or how many immigrants there are from Muslim communities in both countries in terms of percentage, not in terms of like hard numbers, because population differences.
Yeah, I actually have no idea about Canada.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So before we go, I'm going to have to ask you the question that I had to ask John Esposito as well. So you've been studying Islamic conversions for a long time. I'm guessing you would have also have had to study not just immigration and conversion numbers, but to some extent you would have had to study like the theological side of Islam as well, no?
Mm-hmm.
So what's your background? Are you a practicing Catholic? Are you a man of faith? What's your background?
I'm a Christian. I was raised Catholic, but I attend a Christian church of a particular denomination. I don't want to say which one, but yes, I'm practicing, and I am a member of a church.
And do you get accused of being like a closet Muslim by some people, Muslims and non-Muslims?
Well, I don't broadcast my research at church, where there might be some prejudice against that. But some people ask me, but I think Professor Esposito probably gets that a lot more than me, because I personally had assumed he was a Muslim. So I know that, because in the 80s he used to wear a beard.
Really?
And so, yeah, so
When
I had seen
when
pictures
beards
of
were
him.
not even fashionable, as you say back then.
Yeah, so I had assumed he was a Muslim, but later found out that there are other academics like us that find great benefit to studying people who are not like us, but we find a lot of common ground. There's a lot of benefit to that. Mm-hmm.
Also, but because you have a lot of interaction probably with Muslims, I don't know, you've probably been to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's center and other places. So surely some people would have had a go. Did it not work?
Oh yeah. People have attempted to show interest in my faith, but I try to be very upfront, and the review board processes that we are trained in academia in the United States, at least, tries to encourage us to be upfront about the perspective we have. And because of that, I think that's kind of pushed people away, and I haven't been prodded too much.
By the way, have you had an opportunity to visit Georgetown University?
No, I haven't.
No, because
Why is that?
because obviously that's where Professor Esposito's from, but I think they're doing so much work in terms of like Islam in America and trying to kind of fight against stereotypes and things like that. And I'm always curious why that is. Like, is there a bigger population of Muslims there, or is it the funding that's coming in? But it just seems to stand out as when I see it in terms of other institutions. It just seems a lot more kind of uh, inclined towards studying Islam and Muslims and sympathetically.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things going on. I can't speak about George Washington specifically, but oftentimes funding is a issue. Where's the source of funding coming from? But the other time is, in the 21st century, this is the general academic attitude in non-confessional faith confessional universities, and even in some of them, like if you go to a more liberal institution like Iliff School of Theology, that there's an attitude, a desire to have a more humanitarian approach to the study of Islam.
Patrick, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I've personally learned a lot from this conversation. So thank you. And do share any notes, anything like that you'd like me to include in the notes, and I'll make sure I do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Patrick, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. That was a great opportunity for me. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you.